All right. I know, Mr. Speaker, I know that members are anxious to leave, but we have one member of this institution who is leaving for good, and I feel that we are all going to miss him. And I think he has a right to stay safe to the House, whatever is in his heart in this last day, his last day of service in this institution. And with that, I yield 10 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Minge, who has served his district and his country very well in the years that he has been in this institution.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Wisconsin. Almost 8 years ago, I first addressed this body. Today, I speak on the floor for what may be the last time. As has everyone in this House, I've been elected by folks at home to represent them in this, the People's Chamber. It is an honor. It is a privilege. I participated in the 103rd Congress when the Democrats controlled both chambers and the White House. I served in the 104th, the 105th, and the 106th Congresses with Republican majorities and a Democrat in the White House. I've seen bitter party differences and shared the frustration of stalemate and even shutdown. However, I've also felt the occasional sense of cooperation and accomplishment. I don't wish to review the scorecard of this game of power over the last 8 years. Rather, I wish to speak to the challenges that Congress and America face in the years to come. First, for the health and perhaps for the survival of our system of government, we must rehabilitate the way we finance political campaigns. I recognize we will never achieve perfection in campaign finance reform. Money always will undoubtedly be the most seamy side of politics. However, right now we face a veritable political hell. The insidious effect of raising money on policy and even process is tearing at the integrity of our system. By most accounts, over $3 billion has been spent on the year 2000 elections. And what has all this money brought us? It spawned national cynicism, public despair, and increasingly apathy among voters. We must have a fix for this process. Unless good government groups like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Public Citizen, and others have confidence that we are sincerely doing the best we can to enact reforms, our institutions will suffer. In 1993, as a new member of Congress, I was asked by an interviewer from a religious radio station what I thought was the most important problem facing our country. Despite our preoccupation with health care, the deficit, family values, and other matters, I said campaign finance reform. It goes to the heart of the democratic process. Second, our national and global economies are becoming increasingly concentrated. Fewer and fewer businesses dominate more and more sectors of the economy. This threatens our ability to maintain a free market system, the cornerstone of our economy. Antitrust laws and their enforcement are controversial. However, if we do not maintain a commitment to the principle of competition, the dynamics of a vibrant marketplace will be eroded. All of us have heard promises of savings, but also read about the loss of jobs and endless disappointments with mergers. Congress holds one of the keys to enforcement of the principles of competition. Antitrust, fair trade, regulated industries, deregulation, route awarding guidelines, intellectual property, international trade, government contracts, and numerous other areas are contributing components to a competition policy. Consumers, suppliers, and small businesses, including farmers, are at risk in the long term if we are not more vigilant. Third, just as private sector concentration creates problems, unchecked power in government is a threat to the well-being of our society. The perceived problems of a national health care system resulted in health insurance companies and others raising the specter of runaway government power. Mr. Speaker, I believe the House is not in order.
The House is not in order. Members and staff will remove their conversations from the floor. Members and staff will remove their conversations from the floor. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Fairness, lack of effective competition, and stifling of new ideas are problems. The unjust regional disparities in federal health care financing are an example of a continuing and unjust feature of the massive Medicare program. A free society, like a free economy, is threatened by too great a concentration of power in any entity. Countervailing forces are needed. Our challenge in Congress is to structure public programs so such countervailing forces exist without destroying the effectiveness of the programs. Built-in checks are necessary for the long-term effectiveness and fairness of government programs. This problem of power in government extends to elected officials and legislative bodies. Early on, we developed a tradition, now a constitutional rule, that presidents cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Like the executive, the legislative branch can have problems of concentration of power that must be addressed. The term limit movement grew out of the unhappiness of many opponents to 40 years of Democratic majorities in Congress and the seniority system. The 3-year term limit on committee chairs currently in effect in the House is an effort to break up legislative power. This effort should not be abandoned. Fourth, we must better address the fundamental problem of the difficulty of reforming public programs under current legislative procedures. It takes enormous efforts to pass legislation with a bicameral legislative branch, a complex committee system. Senate holds the filibuster, a presidential veto, and often politically divided leadership. Once created, programs are even more difficult to reform. Virtual consensus is needed. The low visibility of most reforms makes them less than exciting and makes it very difficult to attract the national attention and public support needed for their adoption. Efforts to give agencies discretion to reform themselves through the rulemaking is not adequate, nor are judicial review or 5-year reauthorizing bills effective. The result is that once created, federal programs tend to be an automatic pilot. For programs to work effectively, Congress needs to craft a better framework for encouraging needed structural changes. The federal government's far-flung activities and programs have become too significant a part of our nation's economy to be hobbled with this handicap. The process for consideration of reform legislation should be simplified, or quasi-independent status like the Postal Service should be considered for more operations.
Suspend. Will members and staff remove their conversation from the chamber so perhaps maybe the chair could hear the speaker? Gentleman may proceed.
Fifth and finally, we need to constantly recommit ourselves to maintaining respect for one another. The bitter divides in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, in the Middle East, in Africa, and the Indian subcontinent are examples of how supposedly self-governing societies are consumed and can be destroyed by internal animosities. The 1990s have been a turbulent and all too often bitter time here in Congress. We cannot allow our all too genetic predisposition for pride, animosity, jealousy, and bickering to destroy us and our institutions. We must allow the healing process to work. Respect and trust must be constantly nourished. Competition, self-righteousness, negative zeal, political campaigns, and partisanship constantly drags us back into bitter disagreements, often unnecessarily. Testosterone routinely trumps conciliation. Healthy disagreement and a loyal opposition cannot be allowed to degenerate and destroy working relationships. Hopefully, it will not take an external enemy to unite us. We must rise above our differences. Every day, I've walked over to this Capitol, seen the Dome, and realized that this is where our nation's elected representatives meet, deliberate, and make decisions. I'm awed. I've pinched myself that I'm here. I urge that we in Congress never allow ourselves to forget that we have a stewardship responsibility for the survival of our political institutions. Self-governance and personal freedom are the core principles that we as Americans often take for granted. Our 220-year-old system of broad-based self-governance and individual rights is the longest-running democracy in the history of our civilization and perhaps the history of mankind. It is fragile, it is dependent on the trust of our people and our institutions, and we as political leaders must renew the process. We must make it work. We have a stewardship obligation to our children, grandchildren, and future generations to nourish and strengthen this grand experiment and pass it on strong and intact. This will be our generation's greatest success. We cannot afford to fail. I appreciate the opportunity to serve with you, my colleagues. I am honored and humbled to have been elected by a free people. I wish success for the work of the 107th Congress. I hope and pray this body and our system of self-governance and our freedoms continue for countless generations to come. Thank you.